Hi, in this lecture, I'm going to present Descartes' argument for the existence of God. As I said in the previous lecture, the overall argument has a relatively simple form. Descartes uses two premises, and the first one is that I have an idea of God, an idea of a perfect substance or infinite being. Then the second premise is that only God could have produced this idea, and only God could have given me this idea. And if that's the only possible source for this idea of God, then God must exist. You should be asking yourself, why is God necessary to produce this idea, to give me this idea? And that's what most of Descartes' argument, the more extended version of the argument, that's what most of it does, is explain why that's so. What I'll do now is present an interpretation of what Descartes does, in sort of simplification of the rest of the argument. We can interpret Descartes' argument as using two distinct principles, and much of the rest of this lecture is devoted to explaining these principles and then explaining how these two general principles give Descartes what he wants. So the first principle is what can be called degrees of reality. That states that everything that exists, everything that's real, comes in degrees and has degrees of reality. And as we'll see, this amounts to everything having degrees of independence. And we'll talk about that more shortly. Before doing that, the other principle is ex nihilo nihil fit. So that's a Latin phrase meaning nothing comes from nothing. And the basic idea there is that everything has a source that explains its existence, and that nothing could come into existence spontaneously or uncaused. What I'll do now is explain that first principle concerning degrees of reality, and I'll do so by looking at some definitions that are crucial in the first premise. So recall that the first premise states that I have an idea of God. But the idea of God here that Descartes has in mind is the idea of an infinite substance. And those two terms, infinite substance, are really crucial. So we can explain this by looking at some of Descartes' other writings. So in the later work, The Principles, Descartes describes the idea of God as follows. Quote, the idea of a being who is omniscient, omnipotent, and absolutely perfect. So notice he has omniscience, omnipotence, skips omnibenevolence, all being all good, but what we want to focus on is absolute perfection. That notion of perfection is tied to a notion of completion. To say something is perfect is to say that it's complete. And what does it mean to say that something is complete? What doesn't need anything else? So something that's perfect, it doesn't need anything else to be what it is and to be the best version of what it is. So here we can treat the idea of God as the idea of a perfect being, a being that doesn't need anything else. But how are we to understand this notion of a being? Well, Descartes has an easy source for that, the traditional notion of a substance. And so he'll often use the word being and the word substance sort of interchangeably. And looking at that notion of substance will give us the crucial understanding of God that we need. So the word substance is a crucial metaphysical notion, meaning a fundamental reality. If we're to explain what really exists and give an account of the fundamental types of things that exist, then we're going to try to identify the substances, the things that stand under everything else. Descartes describes a substance as follows, quote, a thing which so exists that it needs no other thing in order to exist. In other words, a substance is not dependent on other things in order to exist. So a substance is an independent existence of some sort. But what is that? Well, here we can contrast substances with other kinds of things. Those other kinds of things that Descartes talks about are what he calls modes, qualities, or attributes. So basically what that amounts to are the properties of things. For example, the brown color of my hair is a mere quality. It cannot exist on its own. It needs the hair to support it. The hair itself has a sort of independent existence. It can change color from one moment to the next or over time, but the color cannot just exist on its own, just floating about without a thing to support it. So we can understand substances as things in which properties like colors inhere. And then the colors themselves are these mere qualities that are dependent. But what's crucial for Descartes' purposes here is that among substances, among things, there are some that are more dependent than others, and then some that are less dependent, and hence independent than others. So it's easy to see how myself as a substance, as a living organism, depends on other things, depends on getting water, food, shelter, and so on. And so my existence depends on other things, depends on other substances. And it's this thought that leads to an understanding of what God's perfection or infinitude amounts to. So what does the word infinity mean? It means without limit, or not being limited. When we think of the number series, we tend to think of infinity as the ability to keep adding more and more stuff. Now that is infinite, but it's sort of misleading, because what we're focusing on here is that there's nothing limiting the adding. So we're really thinking in this context whether or not there's something preventing or limiting a thing from doing something. And this applies to God because God is not limited or not dependent on other things in order to exist. So God's existence in that sense is infinite. It doesn't mean that his size goes on and on and on. Rather, his existence doesn't depend on anything else. That's what it means for God to be infinite or perfect. We can now situate Descartes' understanding of God in context of some more traditional understandings. The traditional understanding here is the so-called great chain of being. I have an image on this slide here of this great chain of being. If we look closer, we see at the top there's God, then there's angels of different sorts, then there's human beings, then there's birds, then there's fish, then there's land creatures, then plants, and then at the very bottom you see hell, you see the fallen angels. And how are we supposed to think of all this? We're supposed to think of it in terms of independence. God is the most independent being. He doesn't depend on anything else. Angels are not quite as independent as God, but they are relatively independent. They don't depend on having a body made up of matter. Then human beings have a degree of independence that's more than what other animals have because they have a faculty of reason, a faculty of making free choices. So that gives them independence. Animals are more independent than plants because animals can move around, and so on. So what this shows is that it might seem that talking about degrees of reality can be kind of confusing. Degrees of reality, you might think, well, things either exist or they don't. They're real or they're not. But when we talk about degrees of reality here, we're really talking about how independent are things. Now, Descartes doesn't need this really fine-grained understanding of degrees of reality. He only posits basically three main kinds of degrees. There's God or infinite substance at the top. Then there are finite substances. So this would include human beings, plants, rocks, all sorts of things that exist and are things rather than qualities. But these things depend on God. Finally, there are accidents and modes. Accidents and modes are the things like qualities or properties like the brown color of my hair that depend on something in order to have any sort of existence at all. So that's Descartes' first principle, that we can rank things in terms of degrees of reality, in terms of how independent they are. Let's now turn to the second principle. That second principle is ex nihilo nihil fit. That's a Latin phrase that can be translated from nothing comes nothing. The basic idea there is that nothing can spontaneously come into existence. For our purposes, it's helpful to think about how we can formulate this doctrine positively, and I've done so on the slide. It's that everything that exists has a cause for its existence, has a cause that suffices to bring it about. If something didn't have a cause for why it exists, or didn't have a sufficient cause for why it exists, then it would be produced out of nothing. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, wait, this principle might give us itself a proof for the existence of God. Everything that exists needs a cause for why it exists, and that cause is God. That is not Descartes' argument. It's not that everything that exists needs a cause and therefore God exists. Rather, he's going to narrowly focus on just the idea of God as needing a cause. And why is that? Well, you could accept this principle that nothing comes from nothing and just say that things go on to an infinity, that there's one cause for why I exist, and then for what causes my existence, there's some other cause. For that thing's existence, there's some other cause, and then it keeps going back and back in time, and in an infinite way back in time, such that there's no one single thing that causes everything to exist. This just says that everything has a cause, but not that there is one single cause for all that exists. So what that means is that this principle itself cannot give Descartes what he needs to prove that God exists. It's rather by taking this principle with the idea that we can rank things in terms of degrees of reality, along with the idea that we have this idea of God, and we're focusing on the idea that we have, then Descartes can get his proof. Now let's see how Descartes puts all these thoughts together. The basic kind of chain of reasoning here is that each of my ideas must have a cause for its existence. So not only does everything need an explanation for why it exists, every idea, its existence, needs something to suffice to explain why it exists. So I have an idea of myself. Well, I can produce that idea. Through my very act of thinking, I give myself an idea of myself. We saw that with the cogito. But I also have this idea of God. I had this idea of God, and that's what gave me the ability to formulate the evil genius argument originally. Now what Descartes is wondering is where I get this idea of God. What could cause me to have this idea of God? When I say an idea's content, what I have in mind here is that ideas are like images or perhaps like photographs. So a photograph is a sort of glossy piece of paper, but then the photograph has within it an image. And so the image, what the photograph represents, is the content of that photograph, whereas the photograph itself is just that glossy paper. And if we make that distinction between the idea itself and the content of the idea, then we need an explanation for why the idea exists, as well as for why the content of that idea exists. And at this stage, it's helpful to give a metaphor to explain what Descartes is doing. The metaphor runs as follows. Suppose hypothetically that the world is black and white, that everything that exists has no color and gives off wavelength, frequency, and so on, such that it's all in grayscale or black and white. Now suppose further that you take a photograph of this world. Now the question is, what can that photograph represent or depict? What is the content of that photograph? Well, on Descartes' view, based on the principle nothing comes from nothing, the photograph's content has to be explained by what the photograph has been taken of. So you can ask the question here, could the photograph be given color if everything that exists doesn't have color, but rather is black and white or grayscale? And Descartes' point is no. You cannot produce a photograph with a content or image on it that depicts color. Otherwise, something has come from nothing. Something being color has come from things that are not colored, and we don't have a sufficient explanation for why that color came into the picture. And why are we talking about all this? Well, the basic idea, recall, is that we need a sufficient explanation for an idea's content. If we are to explain our ideas and their content, there must be a sufficient explanation for what they represent. There needs to be a reality corresponding to the reality depicted by our idea. So think of it this way. If we have a color photograph, then there needs to be a reality corresponding to the color in that photograph. The world needs to have color. And so if we have a color photograph, we can infer that there is color to produce the colored photograph. So too with the idea of God. If the idea of God has this particular sort of content, then that content needs a reality to explain why it got that content. So this leads us to see how Descartes combines the two principles. As we saw, what causes an idea to exist must suffice to explain the content of that idea. As we just saw with the metaphor I presented, the cause of an idea must have as much reality as the reality of what the idea represents. If the idea represents color, then what causes the idea has to have a reality of being colored. Otherwise, you got something from nothing. And if we apply this to the idea of God, the cause of my idea of God must have as much reality as what the idea represents. The idea of God represents an infinite being, an infinite reality, but the question now is, where does that idea get its content? How can it depict infinite substance? Well, it cannot depict an infinite substance because of my own existence. I'm only a finite being. Rather, there needs to be a reality that is itself infinite in order to produce that idea's content. So this leads us to see how we can reformulate the original argument. Once again, it begins with the thought that I have an idea of God, an idea of an infinite substance, but we add here the point that we just saw, that finite things such as myself or other things in the external world cannot cause the content of the idea of something infinite. I cannot get the idea of something independent, of something unlimited from myself, because I'm a mere finite being, a being that is limited and dependent. But likewise, I cannot get it from other things that are dependent or limited or finite. So there must be something that is itself independent, infinite, perfect, and that thing is God. Only God could produce the idea of God, could produce the content of the idea of God. Therefore, God must exist. So that's the argument. In the next lecture, I'll explain how Descartes uses this argument to establish some further conclusions, and I'll likewise explain some objections that have been raised to the argument.